Jake Morrison was elbow-deep in the mining drill's hydraulic system when he first felt the eyes on him, and the sensation crawled up his spine like static electricity, making him pause mid-wrench turn, and when he looked up, she was there standing, maybe 20 feet away on the catwalk above the maintenance bay. She was tall, impossibly tall easily. 7 feet of corded muscle wrapped in violet skin that seemed to shimmer with patterns he couldn't quite focus on, and her eyes were fixed on him, with an intensity that made his mouth go dry, but he figured aliens were curious about humans, so he gave an awkward wave and went back to work. The mining colony on Threshold Station wasn't exactly a tourist destination, so when the Caltherian trade ship docked, everyone took notice because the Caltherians had a reputation across 3 sectors as warriors, merchants, and occasionally mercenaries, but mostly they kept to themselves in their matriarchal clans. Director Martinez mentioned during the morning briefing that they'd be here for a week negotiating mineral rights and everyone should be professional and courteous, which really meant don't stare at the 7-foot purple Amazon warriors walking around, and definitely don't cause an interstellar incident. Jake saw her again that afternoon in the cafeteria, and she wasn't just looking anymore. She was studying him, like he was a particularly interesting piece of machinery that she wanted to take apart and understand. And when their eyes met, she didn't look away, didn't even blink, just held his gaze until he felt heat creeping up his neck and had to focus very hard on his synthetic protein lunch buy. The third day it was getting weird, because everywhere he went she appeared, and not in a sneaky way either. She would just be standing there in plain sight watching him calibrate equipment or run diagnostics, or even just walking down a corridor, and once he turned a corner and nearly ran into her because she'd been standing right around the edge waiting. Her name was Zara. Or at least that's what she told him when she finally approached while he was replacing power couplings in Junction 7. And her voice was deeper than he expected, with a resonance that he felt in his chest, and she asked him what he was doing. Even though it was pretty obvious, he explained about the power fluctuations and the need for upgraded couplings, and she listened with complete attention, asking questions about tensile strength and energy throughput that showed she understood engineering better than half his crew. And when he finished, she reached out and touched the wrench in his hand, letting her fingers brush against his for just a moment before walking away. The 4th day, she brought him something wrapped in dark cloth, and when he unwrapped it, he found a curved fang as long as his forearm polished to a gleaming white, and she explained in careful English that she'd hunted a Kreth beast in the station's lower unused sections where they'd been breeding unnoticed, and this was her trophy for him. He thanked her, assuming it was some kind of diplomatic gift or maybe just alien friendship customs, and put it on his workbench where it looked impressively dangerous and vaguely threatening. And his coworker Danny walked past and stopped dead, staring at the fang with wide eyes before looking at Jake like he'd grown a second head. The next day, Zara found him in the training gym during his off hours where he was running through basic maintenance of his physique. Nothing impressive, just enough to stay healthy in the station's artificial gravity. And she asked if she could use the space, and he said sure, because the gym was open to everyone. What followed was the most impressive display of combat skills he'd ever witnessed outside of professional streams, because she moved through forms that blended grace and lethality in ways that didn't seem possible, given her size and mass. And when she finished, she looked at him expectantly, like a cat that had just dropped a dead bird at someone's feet waiting for praise. He told her that was amazing, really impressive technique, and she seemed pleased and moved closer, asking if he wanted to learn. And he laughed, saying he'd probably just embarrass himself, but appreciated the offer, and she smiled, showing teeth that were definitely sharper than human normal, and said he was humble, which was good. On the 6th day, everything changed because Jake was working on one of the primary atmosphere processors 3 levels down when a coupling he'd just flagged for replacement decided to fail early, and suddenly he was staring at a spray of superheated coolant that would cook him in his suit in about 5 seconds. He didn't even see her move, but suddenly Zara was there between him and the spray, and her arm was around his waist, and they were 15 feet away behind a support pillar, and the coolant was eating into the deck where he'd been standing, and his heart was trying to break out through his ribs. She didn't let go right away either, and her arm stayed locked around him, holding him against her, and he could feel the heat radiating off her body and smell something like ozone and cinnamon And when he looked up at her face, her eyes were doing something strange. The violet irises flickering with light from within. 2 other Caltharians appeared within seconds, responding to some signal he hadn't noticed. And when they saw Zara holding him, they both stopped, and one of them made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough, and said something in their language that made Zara's grip tighten, and her reply was sharp enough that they both backed off after the emergency crews secured the coolant leak. Jake tried to thank her properly, but she just kept touching him, checking him over for injuries with hands that were surprisingly gentle, despite looking like they could crush steel. And she seemed angry not at him, but at the situation, at the fact that he'd been in danger. That evening, his co-worker Lisa cornered him in the break room with a look on her face that was somewhere between amused and concerned, and asked if he knew what was happening with the Caltharian warrior, and he said yeah, she'd been really friendly. Probably curious about humans, Lisa laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee, and then explained that among Caltharians, the females were the hunters and warriors, and when they found a male they considered worthy, they courted through displays of prowess and gift-giving and protective behavior, and basically everything Zara had been doing for almost a week. Jake felt his entire world tilt sideways because suddenly all those moments replayed in his head with completely different context. And the fang wasn't a friendship gift, it was a courtship trophy, and the combat display wasn't showing off. It was a mating dance, and the way she kept appearing everywhere wasn't curiosity. It was tracking, and the protective, possessive way she'd held him after the accident that was claiming behavior. He sat down hard because an elite alien warrior had apparently decided he was mate material, and he'd been completely oblivious, and Lisa was still laughing, saying that the entire station had been watching this play out like some kind of reality show, and taking bets on when he'd figure it out. That night he couldn't sleep because his mind was racing through every interaction trying to figure out how he felt about this, and Zara was impressive, definitely, and there was something appealing about being chosen specifically not for his looks, which were average at best, but apparently for his skills and his character, and the way he approached problems. The next morning he found her in the observation deck watching the stars through the viewport, and she turned when he entered with that same intense focus, and he walked up to her and asked directly if what Lisa said was true. Zara didn't deny it, and her English was better than she'd been letting on when she explained that, yes, she had chosen him and had been courting him according to her people's customs, but she understood humans did things differently and required consent and choice, and she would respect that even though every instinct in her body said he was hers. He asked why him, and she tilted her head considering and said because he was clever with his hands and patient with complex problems and didn't waste energy on posturing or dominance displays. And when the emergency happened, his first thought was to warn others even while in danger himself. And those were the traits her people valued in mates. Jake took a breath and surprised himself by saying that he was interested, but not as some trophy or possession. And if they were going to do this, it had to be a partnership between equals. And he saw something flash in her eyes, and she moved closer, radiating heat and presence. She said that was acceptable, and actually made him more attractive because strength came in many forms, and the courage to negotiate terms with a Caltharian huntress showed the kind of spine her people admired. And then she asked in a lower voice if he accepted her claim. He said yes, but on those terms, partnership, not ownership. And she made a sound deep in her chest that was almost a purr, and reached out to cup his face with one large hand, and her thumb traced his cheekbone. And she said he was hers now, and she was his and her. Clan would accept him. The bonding ritual happened 2 days later before her crew and the station's senior staff, and involved her presenting him with a second fang matching the first, and him accepting it and then giving her a custom-made tool he'd fabricated from station materials designed specifically for Caltharian hand dimensions, and she'd looked at it with something like Wonder Director Martinez, looked relieved that this had resolved peacefully and possibly opened up better trade relations. And Danny wouldn't stop grinning, and Lisa collected her winnings from the betting pool, and Jake stood next to a 7-foot alien warrior who kept touching him possessively and realized his life had